They handed him 12 pages. 12 pages of surrender signed by no one, written by strangers who thought sovereignty could be folded into paper. They called it diplomacy. He called it chains. The script was clear. Apologize, adjust your tone, reaffirm their values, bow low, and walk away. But Ibrahim Traoré did not come to New York to read their words. He came to remind the world that Africa does not apologize for breathing. This is not about one man nor one speech. It is about a continent told for 4 centuries that silence was survival. It is about the choice between kneeling in comfort or standing in dignity. When the young president of a landlocked nation refused the apology, he did more than defy an institution. He cracked the mask of an old order that believed Africa would always be grateful for crumbs. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and keep watching, because this story is not just history unfolding. It is a revolution in voice, a seed planted in soil that has waited too long for harvest. It began not with applause but with accusation. 2 months before the storm in New York, Ibrahim Traoré stood before microphones and said words many preferred left unspoken. He compared the cries of mothers in Gaza to the cries of mothers in Mali, Congo, and Niger. He said silence in Africa was complicity, and for that, the so-called guardians of peace declared his truth too dangerous. A letter soon arrived from the office of the Secretary General. It accused him of undermining cooperation, of creating diplomatic tension. It asked him to return to the Assembly, not to speak, but to clarify. Yet the letter was never about clarity. It was about control. They wished to turn his voice into a confession. Then came the calls. From Paris with reminders of old colonial ties. From Washington with polite threats disguised as offers. From Tel Aviv with warnings cloaked in talk of regional stability. The script thickened. 4 pages of apology for tone, 3 for language, 5 for loyalty. 12 pages in total. 12 pages to erase a continent's dignity. But the pressure did not stop with letters. 3 nights later, long after midnight, his private phone rang. The line known only to a handful of trusted aides. The caller introduced himself as Ambassador Richardson from the United States. Within minutes, a black SUV pulled into Ouagadougou's presidential palace. No flags, no plates, no ceremony. Just leather briefcases filled with documents, satellite images of gold mines, contracts with Chinese engineers, notes on Russian advisors and Iranian pharmaceuticals. We know everything, Richardson whispered, laying the papers bare. And right now, we choose to call it cooperation instead of what it really is. But that choice depends on you. The words hung heavy in the room. For 6 months, Burkina Faso had been quietly diversifying every pillar of its future. Telecommunications with Beijing, agriculture with Moscow, medicine with Tehran. Not as acts of hostility, but as acts of survival. Dependency was slavery with better marketing, and Traoré had sworn to end it. The ambassador leaned forward. Mr. President, you can still make your point at the United Nations. But why not do it softly? Why risk everything? Traoré asked him calmly. When your country invaded Iraq, did you apologize first? Silence. When France intervened in Mali, did they seek African permission? Silence again. When Israel bombs Palestinian schools, do they draft apology speeches? The briefcase was closed. The men left. And the president called his security chief. 17 foreign operatives under surveillance, perhaps double hidden. All phone lines tapped, yet fed falsehoods for months. Smiling, he ordered a rumor. Leak that I may consider reading their apology. A decoy, bait for those who thought pressure had broken him. The next day, Western embassies celebrated. News outlets reported compromise. Analysts spoke of victory. Yet at Revolution Square, 50,000 gathered to hear their president speak not of retreat, but of resistance. Old women wept. Young men roared. Children too young to grasp geopolitics felt the fire in the air. They think Africa apologizes, he told them. They think permission is still required for us to breathe. But when I stand at the United Nations, I stand not only for Burkina Faso, I stand for every African told to beg for crumbs. That roar shook the night sky. It was not the sound of one nation's defiance. It was the sound of a continent remembering its voice. And as he boarded the plane to New York, the script of apology remained folded, untouched. What he carried instead was the weight of history, the eyes of his people, and the decision that had already been made. But before I tell you what happened in that chamber, let us stay in those final days. The days when the world believed he would bow, and when he prepared instead to rise. The chamber was heavy that morning. Delegates shuffled their papers, whispered behind translation headsets. adjusted microphones that had carried countless speeches before. But as Ibrahim Traoré walked toward the podium, there was no mistaking the tension. He was the young leader they said would be cautious, corrected, subdued. They expected contrition. They expected a bow. Instead, he adjusted the microphone once and began with fire. Before you ask me to apologize, let me ask you something. How many times have you apologized for what you have done to Africa? The hall fell into a silence more profound than noise. Cameras zoomed, heads turned. He did not pause to measure approval. He pressed on. Did Belgium ever apologize for Congo? Did France ever apologize for massacres in Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that bled our soil? You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke truth. But when bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When African children starve under your trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic. Every sentence landed like stone upon glass. He spoke not of policy but of centuries. Not of diplomacy but of dignity. The French delegate rose abruptly and stormed out. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Yet he did not chase applause. He chased clarity. Then, breaking the formality of international ritual, he pulled a phone from his pocket. This, he said, is a message I received this morning. The room braced for spectacle. It is from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou. She wrote, Mr. President, my teacher says you are going to America to speak for us. Please do not let them make you small. We are proud to be African. His voice softened as he looked up. That child has more dignity than this entire assembly. Gasps rippled through the hall. Security guards shifted nervously. This was no script. This was defiance scripted by history itself. Then he spoke words none expected. I will apologize. I will apologize that it took this long for an African to stand here without fear. I will apologize that my predecessors believed sovereignty was negotiable. I will apologize that our children were taught to beg for recognition. But I will not apologize for rejecting occupation dressed as diplomacy. I will not apologize for refusing partnerships that impoverish us. I will not apologize for being African and proud. The silence was absolute. No applause, no interruption. Yet every diplomat knew something irreversible had occurred. Because 3 hours later, the African Union called an emergency session. 43 ambassadors met in a small conference room at the Ethiopian mission. For the first time in decades, they did not debate aid packages or conditional loans. They debated revolution. Not with guns, but with dignity. Not with coups, but with unity. By midnight, a document was born, the New York Declaration. Within 48 hours, 12 African presidents had signed it, vowing no more conditional aid, no more apologies for sovereignty, no more foreign dictation of policy. Meanwhile, the streets answered with their own thunder. In Nairobi, students held Dignity Day. In Lagos, market women refused products linked to illegal settlements. In Accra, musicians sampled his speech into songs. In Cape Town, murals bloomed with chains broken. The unbroken line from Nkrumah to Mandela to Traoré. The headlines screamed across continents. Africa refuses to kneel. Western capitals reeled. In Washington, think tanks warned of dangerous precedent. In Paris, editorials labeled him reckless. In Brussels, officials whispered of sanctions. Yet in Harlem, a mural appeared overnight. His silhouette before the map of Africa. 3 words painted bold. No apology given. The chamber in New York had expected submission. Instead, it witnessed ignition. But let me tell you what happened after that speech. Because the retaliation came swiftly, and the reckoning even faster. The speech had ended, but the echo traveled faster than jets. Within hours, the corridors of diplomacy filled with whispers. By midnight, the European Union announced it would freeze $27 million in development funds. The International Monetary Fund quietly postponed a debt relief review. French media launched coordinated attacks, branding him authoritarian, reckless, a populist with no plan. One American think tank issued a warning. Burkina Faso risks isolation unless its leader learns the art of diplomacy. Yet for the streets of Africa, the word isolation translated differently. What the West called punishment, many began calling independence. In Ouagadougou's Revolution Square, thousands poured out not in protest but in celebration. Mothers lifted their children onto shoulders, declaring, "This is the day they heard us." University students painted banners. Dignity is not negotiable. Market vendors refused to sell imported products from companies complicit in illegal occupations. The resistance was no longer confined to speeches. It became daily bread. Across the continent, movements ignited. In Nairobi, classrooms turned into forums for self-determination. In Lagos, women's cooperatives began sourcing only from African-owned suppliers. In Accra, songs born from Traoré's words filled radio stations. In Cape Town, artists splashed walls with chains breaking, fists rising, faces unbowed. The effect was not only cultural, it was political. The African Union's New York Declaration gained signatures rapidly. Within days, 12 presidents had affixed their names. Within weeks, more debated joining. It was not about Burkina Faso alone. It was about reclaiming the principle that sovereignty was not for negotiation. Of course, retaliation deepened. Western analysts spoke of coups and whispers, of destabilization campaigns. Rumors surfaced that Traoré's government was a pawn of Moscow, of Beijing, of Tehran. The narrative of the Ibrahim Traoré coup began circulating, as if his very refusal to apologize was itself a coup against the established order. They painted him as a radical threatening stability, a man too bold for the safety of partnership. But within Burkina Faso, the supposed isolation became an engine. Diaspora communities sent money not as charity, but as investment. Farmers spoke of pride when refusing imported seed and turning instead to ancestral techniques. Engineers, doctors, and teachers returned home. At one university, enrollment in engineering doubled within a single semester. At rural cooperatives, agricultural membership surged by 300%. The government, far from crumbling, pivoted. Funds once tied to foreign aid were redirected into self-sufficiency projects. Telecommunication lines built with Chinese engineers began connecting remote villages. Russian agronomists taught farmers soil restoration ignored for decades. Iranian pharmaceutical labs opened doors that supplied clinics across the nation. For ordinary Burkinabe, dignity became tangible. Not abstract rhetoric, but food on the table, medicine in hospitals, voices in classrooms. The cost of defiance was sanctions, but the reward was sovereignty. And across the continent, leaders felt the tremor. In Tanzania, contracts with mining corporations were reopened. In Zambia, copper exports were redirected towards states that recognized Palestinian sovereignty. In Senegal, military bases faced deadlines for evacuation. Each action framed not only as economic policy, but as continuation of the refusal to bow. The Western press called it a crisis of diplomacy. Many Africans called it the beginning of a revolution in self-respect. Still, questions remain. Could the momentum survive the backlash? Could one young president carry the weight of centuries on his shoulders? Could Africa, long divided by borders drawn with rulers, finally find unity in refusal? But what terrified those watching from Paris, Washington, and Brussels was not the anger of the speech. It was its precision, its competence, the realization that Africa was not speaking with rage alone, but with strategy. And that meant the balance of power had shifted, not in years or decades, but in a single moment of unapologetic truth. While sanctions struck and Western headlines turned sharp, elsewhere, the resonance was entirely different. The Caribbean was listening. Within 3 days of the New York speech, Haiti's prime minister called directly, "You have given us permission to remember who we are." Within a week, Port-au-Prince announced withdrawal from structural adjustment programs of the World Bank. Soon Jamaica followed, then Trinidad and Tobago, then the Dominican Republic. Small island nations, long bent under conditional aid, now echoed a single declaration: dignity before dependency. This domino did not stop at the Caribbean Sea. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited his words in land rights campaigns. Aboriginal leaders in Australia invoked the speech in sovereignty debates. Pacific Island states, facing rising seas and colonial legacies, began speaking with a new language in climate negotiations. No apology, no surrender. For the global South, the Burkina Faso revolution was not simply African. It was universal, a template of refusal, a demonstration that dignity could be spoken into existence without permission. Meanwhile, Western policy rooms simmered. In Washington, think tanks warned of contagion. A leaked State Department memo assessed the Traoré effect as a fundamental threat. If replicated across Africa, traditional leverage mechanisms could collapse within 5 years. In Paris, ministries spoke of the Burkina model spreading to Francophone states. In Brussels, diplomats admitted privately that sanctions risked hardening resolve rather than weakening it. International media could not contain the narrative. In Nairobi, students marched with signs reading, "He speaks for us." In Harlem, a mural appeared overnight. Africa behind his silhouette, painted in blood-red letters, "No apology given." Radio stations in Kingston broadcast the speech in full, calling it the dawn of a new era. The United Nations chamber had witnessed defiance, but what followed was more dangerous for those invested in silence: multiplication. His refusal did not stay in New York. It seated itself in Accra, in Port of Spain, in Port-au-Prince, in Sydney, in Suva. It became the lexicon of a rising majority tired of footnotes in someone else's history. What began as an isolated confrontation was now a global contagion of dignity. And the question haunting Western capitals was no longer whether Traoré would apologize. It was who might be next to refuse. 6 months after the storm in New York, a quiet miracle unfolded in the fields of Burkina Faso. Not through aid shipments, not through imported seeds, but through the hands of farmers using ancestral knowledge. For the first time in modern memory, the nation reached full food security. The symbolism was unmissable. The same country whose leader refused to apologize at the United Nations no longer needed assistance from the same institutions demanding submission. Harvests doubled when imported hybrids were abandoned. Irrigation networks, once neglected, were restored with local tools. Crops adapted to Burkina soil thrived when free of foreign expertise. What outsiders dismissed as primitive had been resilience all along. Dignity was no longer just spoken, it was eaten, shared, and planted back into the ground. 1 year later, the ripple became a tide. 17 African states renegotiated mining agreements. 23 launched sovereign wealth funds. 31 invested in indigenous technology initiatives. 42 signed intra-African trade pacts, bypassing old intermediaries. What politicians had stalled for years, ordinary people now demanded into being. And then came the image that crystallized the moment. As Traoré returned from New York, an old man approached his car in Revolution Square. He was a veteran of independence, cane carved from local wood, steps slow but eyes alive. In his hand, a piece of cloth, Burkina Faso's first flag, raised in 1960. He placed it into the president's palm and said, "Freedom is not a gift. It is a choice you make every day." That encounter was no less powerful than the chamber speech, because the true test was not whether one leader could speak without fear, but whether a generation could act without apology. Across the continent, young activists launched tours teaching sovereignty. Farmers organized cooperatives beyond borders. Musicians, painters, lawyers, traders, all found new language in defiance. Not rejection of the world, but rejection of inferiority. Not hatred of others, but love of dignity. This was the path ahead, uncertain, costly, dangerous. Retaliation from abroad was certain, setbacks inevitable. But the seed had been planted. And once planted, dignity germinates in silence, grows in hardship, and one day breaks through concrete. The world now watched not a president, but a continent. And the choice facing Africa was no longer whether to bow, it was whether to rise together. But this is not the end, it is only the beginning. The speech at the United Nations was never about an apology. It was about a threshold, a line drawn after centuries of silence. When Ibrahim Traoré refused to bend, he reminded Africa that dignity is not negotiable. And he reminded the world that sovereignty cannot be written out of history by foreign pens. This was not simply a clash between one president and one institution. It was a declaration that 400 years of bowing had ended. That what the West calls isolation, Africans can choose to call independence. That the future is not in aid packages, but in seeds planted, contracts rewritten, voices raised. Across capitals from Nairobi to Kingston, from Lagos to Harlem, his words became more than memory. They became a mirror. And in that mirror, millions saw not weakness but worth. Not dependency, but determination. Some called it reckless. Others called it a coup of dignity, an Ibrahim Traoré coup against the script of submission. Yet for many it was something greater. The Burkina Faso revolution, born not of weapons but of words, not of armies but of voices refusing to apologize for existence. And so the question remains, if one small landlocked nation can rise, what stops the rest of Africa? If a generation taught to bow can suddenly stand, who can make them kneel again? Perhaps history will remember this as the moment Africa ceased being an object of pity and became a subject of pride. The day a folded script of apology was replaced by an unwritten script of sovereignty. If you believe dignity is worth defending, if you believe voices should not need permission, then stay with this story. Subscribe, share, and let the world know Africa does not apologize. Africa rises.